Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 160 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I've got a couple of articles to share with you about foreign policy, and I think that these two articles, they're both from the Mises Institute at Mises.org. I think will help give us some perspective about some of the conflict that's going on around the world, particularly in Ukraine and Russia, and also in Israel, and between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But part of the reason or the impetus behind sharing these two articles is the recent use of these missiles. They're the ATACMS missiles. They're Army Tactical Missile Systems, which are made by the United States. And I think they're relatively long-range missiles, which is seen as a provocation, I think justifiably so, as a provocation by the Russians because of their long-range capability. But nevertheless, these articles aren't really about those missiles in particular, but about foreign policy more broadly. And I think that we've deviated significantly from the view of foreign policy of the founders and what the Constitution authorizes. I mean, there hasn't been a declaration of war since World War II, and it seems like we've been in continual war since World War II. So I think that the government and particularly the military-industrial complex survives and thrives on war. And I won't say who, but I know somebody a friend who is acquainted with somebody who works within the military-industrial complex in some form, who made the statement that all of a sudden peace broke out. It was like peace was a bad thing because they wouldn't have munitions or equipment or whatever to sell in times of peace. Ordinarily you would say conflict or war or what have you broke out, but in this case, peace broke out. And that just sort of tells you the sort of mindset that people in the swamp and the military industrial complex have with respect to foreign policy and with respect to the use of taxpayer dollars and the defense assets that the United States has. But before we get to those two articles, I just want to make a couple of announcements. We're hosting Ed Monk on December 3rd in Salem, Indiana at the Salem Assembly of God for his seminar, A Church-Focused Study of the Active Shooter Problem and How to Minimize Victims. That's from 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. It's a 2.5-hour seminar. The cost to attend is $40. That will help us offset some of the cost of getting Ed Monk to Indiana from Arkansas. And of course, as many of you know, if you've been longtime listeners, my father and I met Ed Monk in Dallas at the NRA annual meeting in the spring, and we were really impressed by his material, his presentation there. And I think that lots of folks would get a lot out of his presentation, even if you don't attend church, even if you're not a church leader. I think a lot of what he has to say is broadly applicable across different and various domains in just about any group setting. Of course, a lot of what he'll say in this particular seminar is tailored toward churches, but again, I think the lessons he has to teach are applicable in lots of other settings. So if you can make it, if you're not too far from Salem, Indiana, on Tuesday, December the 3rd, go sign up. You can find the sign up page at forgeoffreedom.com/active shooter. And there's a link there. There's a lot of information there, first of all, about Ed Monk and the seminar. There's also a link there to the Eventbrite sign up page. And actually, if I can do it here relatively quickly, I'll put those links up on the screen. So this is the forgeofreedom.com/active shooter page. You'll see there's information about Ed Monk, about the seminar. There's also the link there to the Eventbrite sign-up page. So if you're interested in that, go sign up. If you know somebody who may be interested, would really appreciate it if you could share the information about the seminar. We just have a week left before Ed is here to give that presentation. So that's the Forge of Freedom page, and then this is the Eventbrite page where you can buy the tickets and sign up for that event. All right, so that's the first announcement. The next and last announcement before we get into these articles is I wanted to remind everyone that I have been writing a regular column for Gun Digest called Drawing Conclusions, and there are now 10 articles that I've written posted over at Gun Digest. They haven't all been published in the magazine yet. They're published online before they're published in the magazine, but those articles are available over on their website. You can see it here on the screen if you're watching the podcast by video. But I'd encourage you to go check those out. The most recent article is Self-Defense, Who Calls 911 After a Shooting? And that article discusses who might be the best person to call. Is it you? Is it a significant other like your wife or your child? And those considerations that you should take into account there with respect to the 911 call. And then also more relatively recent article, The Importance of Carrying with a Round in the Chamber. You hear often at gun shops people talking about, I Israeli carry. I never carry with a round in the chamber. When I need it, I'll just draw my firearm and rack the slide or press the trigger twice if I've got a revolver. And I talk about why that's not the appropriate method or strategy to take. So definitely go check those articles out, as well as those other 8 that I have posted there. Of course, those come out about once a month. Occasionally there's a special article that will come out. So keep an eye out for that. And I post these generally on X as well. So you can find the links on our X page at Forge of Freedom. All right, with that, let's get into the 2 articles from Mises.org. The first is called Rothbard Was Right. Wars don't enhance freedom. They destroy liberty. And this is an article from April 27th, 2023. So it's over a year old by now. But this article is by Mihai Macovei, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's Mihai, and then last name Macovei. And I'll link to this, of course, in the show notes. But this article is primarily about the conflict in Ukraine. And as I said, it was written in April of 2023. So let's get into it here. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Western leaders have declared that Ukraine was defending not only its own freedom, but ours too. President Joe Biden, to whom apparently freedom is priceless, vowed to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. In turn, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the American support for Ukraine is not charity, but an investment in global security. Other commentators also argue that a Ukrainian victory would strengthen global freedom by deterring other aggressions from autocratic powers like China. Yet these positions are at odds with the clear anti-war stance of Murray Rothbard, one of the most prominent American libertarians of the 20th century. Rothbard made a clear distinction between the interests of governments as opposed to those of private individuals, which are subject to the government's monopoly of violence in a specific territory. He believed that all interstate wars lead to an increase in the government aggression of both domestic and foreign individuals. The aggression against innocent people is inevitable because each state derives its capacity to wage war from taxpayers. In the case of a military conflict, it will intensify its local aggression either through taxation or conscription, or both. At the same time, because the citizens of the enemy country are the resources allowing their state to fight, they and their property will be targeted through military action. According to Rothbard, war never enhances freedom, only domestic tyranny, a tyranny that usually lingers long after the war is over. Therefore, any libertarian should pressure governments to avoid going to war against other countries and negotiate peace as soon as war breaks out. However, let's see if the conflict in Ukraine is likely to advance freedom or not. The human cost of the war in Ukraine, borne primarily by two belligerents, appears huge already. The number of military casualties is not certain, as both sides are downplaying their own losses and exaggerating the ones of the enemy. Yet third-party estimates claim that Russia has suffered around 100,000 to 130,000 casualties, wounded and killed, to Ukraine's 100,000, making the conflict one of the bloodiest in modern history. This is not counting about 30,000 Ukrainian civilian casualties and the many civilians dragged by force into the army. Russia drafted 300,000 reservists and conscripts in late 2022, whereas Ukraine declared martial law in February 2022 and may have already drafted around 1 million people. In addition, about a third of the Ukrainian pre-war population, 13 million people, have left their homes due to the war, of which around 8.1 million fled abroad, showing the full size of aggression against innocent civilians. The economic cost of the war is also massive for Ukraine, Russia, and the West. Ukraine's economy lost more than 30% of its gross domestic product, or $60 billion just in 2022. Ukraine could not have supported the war effort without substantial military, financial, and humanitarian aid from the West, estimated at about $133 billion for the first year of war alone. Estimates for the cost of reconstructing Ukraine after the war vary widely between $411 billion and $1 trillion. The West is expected to pay the lion's share of the reconstruction bill, with some possible support from about $3 billion in foreign exchange reserves seized from Russia. Although Russia suffered only a 2 to 3% decline in real GDP in 2022, despite heavy Western economic sanctions, its economic prospects are also bleak given the withdrawal of foreign companies, curtailed access to Western technologies, and lasting increases in defense budgets. The indirect economic fallout of the war is much broader, and its scars will last for many years to come. Following previous ultra-loose monetary and fiscal policies, the war-induced hike in international energy and food prices led to a surge in global inflation. This was one of the main factors that slowed global economic growth to just 3.1% in 2022 versus pre-war projections of around 5%, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The sharpest economic slowdown is taking place in Europe due to its decoupling from cheap Russian gas and oil. European countries have spent an astronomical 800 billion euro, or more than 4% of GDP, to shield households and companies from soaring energy costs so far. Stimulated by the war, global defense spending is likely to surge as well, with an increase of between 375 billion euros to 453 billion euros expected in Europe between 2021 and 2026. Even if the United States seems to benefit from higher sales of gas and armament, these benefits are restricted to a small number of energy and arms producers, whereas ordinary taxpayers are hit by inflation and increased government spending on transfers to Ukraine. Global public debt, already at record high levels since World War II, will become an even heavier burden to taxpayers, in particular in advanced economies. Last but not least, the growing global North-South division threatens to accelerate de-globalization trends and overall impoverishment. Not only have the two belligerents curtailed the freedom of press in favor of war and propaganda, but so have the more mature Western liberal democracies. There is a long history of government and propaganda and encroachment upon the freedom of press and civil liberties in times of war in the U.S. as well. It started during the American Civil War when more than 300 opposition newspapers in the North were shut down. Government interference with Western media has continued through the wars in Iraq and Libya, whose official justifications remain highly controversial. The Patriot Act also includes government surveillance of both the media and individual dissidents. Therefore, it is not surprising that the main Western media organizations have run a suspiciously uniform narrative about the war in Ukraine from day one and seemed fully engaged in the information war. It could be that the media is very centralized and directly controlled by governments, or that it imposes a voluntary self-censorship due to a general weakening of the Western liberal tradition, similar to the pro-Soviet propaganda during World War II decried by George Orwell. The result is more or less the same, with biased information disseminated to the public, even though half of Americans believe that news channels deliberately manipulate public opinion. This also became quite clear in the Ukraine war when many headline stories were contradicted by subsequent events, such as Russia's alleged sabotage of its own gas pipelines under the Baltic Sea, or Russia's supposed chronic shortage of modern weapons and ammunition, whereas the opposite proved to be true. When official propaganda fails to influence public opinion, governments have no qualms about ignoring community voices altogether. Protest demonstrations against the war took place in many European cities, but were either ignored or downplayed by the mainstream media. According to the European Union's Eurobarometer survey, only about 33% of Bulgarians and 38% of Slovaks agree with supplying military equipment to Ukraine. Yet the former Bulgarian prime minister recalled how his government secretly provided Kiev with vital supplies of weapons and ammunition via intermediaries. The Slovak government decided to send not only tanks, but also MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. It makes one wonder why, in allegedly healthy democracies, the people are not consulted directly via referenda on major issues, at least, which may involve going to war or having a significant impact on civil and economic liberties. Instead of expanding freedom, the conflict in Ukraine has actually restrained civil liberties, economic prosperity, and government accountability, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also in the West. It is possible that the end of the war will bring more freedom for some Ukrainians who integrate Western political and economic alliances or move abroad. Yet one cannot say for sure how Ukraine's liberalization process will turn out given its disappointing track record. At the same time, the erosion of democratic practices and economic liberties in the West is all too real. Regardless of what politicians want us to believe, Rothbard's libertarian view that government wars are always to be avoided or quickly ended by peace negotiations appears to be vindicated. All right, there you go. So that's the end of the first article by Mihai Makovey. And again, the article was called Rothbard Was Right. Wars don't enhance freedom, they destroy liberty. And this was written over about a year and a half ago. And so the costs that are cited in this article are obviously outdated, and the losses to this point have obviously amassed and are significantly larger. But you see a lot of what he's talking about here, sort of the vestiges of this war machine that Eisenhower, in fact, warned about after World War II, that they would take on a life of their own and become sort of self-perpetuating parts of the government, because they don't just, these companies that are making arms, that are making armaments, that are making artillery, that are making fighter jets, and so on, they want to continue to sell those. And they sell them often through these sort of proxy wars like what's going on in Ukraine. So that is, and by proxy, I mean the U.S. is not directly fighting with Russia, but we are providing funding, we are providing arms to Russia or to Ukraine to fight Russia. And as a matter of fact, that's been one of the points of contention about the recent missile attack, is that these ATACMS missiles, the ATACMS missiles, have to be operated by U.S. military personnel. Now, I don't have a source for that at my fingertips, but I believe that to be accurate. So if that's true, that would be seen, I think, by the Russians as more of a direct attack by the U.S. rather than a sort of proxy attack with U.S. arms by Ukraine. And these missiles are, as I said, they're long-range missiles. My understanding is that they have a range of between 100 and 200 miles, depending on the particular missile that's being referred to. But the other thing that's interesting about these is that we essentially have a lame duck president. Biden stepped out of the presidential race earlier this year. President Trump, or former President Trump, and has just won the most recent election, and it will take office in January. And while we have this lame duck president, Biden authorizes the use of these missiles and this is, I think, legitimately considered an act of war. So I think that, I don't know, I struggle to see why Biden would authorize this unless, for a couple of reasons, he is just a deep state military industrial complex puppet, which seems very plausible, or he wants to hand a bad hand, so to speak, to Donald Trump when he takes office. I think both are possible. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think he could have authorized this missile attack for both of those reasons. But the other thing is that, remember, the reason that Biden stepped out of the race is because he was seen by his own party as being unfit, mentally unfit to run for re-election, based on his debate performance. And so, as a mentally unfit president, he's authorized Ukraine to use these long-range missiles inside Russia. So I think it's incredibly reckless. I think it's a significant provocation of a already unjustified war. And I think that anybody close to decision making and foreign policy should heed the advice of Murray Rothbard. So let's get to this second article here. Oh, and just one more thing before we do move on to the second article. The other thing that this article mentions is the Patriot Act. I mean, remember, the military-industrial complex is sort of a vestige of World War II, and we've had all these wars without a declaration of war from Congress since that time. But that escalated, especially after 9/11 and the war on terror. And of course, this war on terror carried on for years and years, and the main target was Osama bin Laden and his ragtag team of terrorists who had hijacked these planes. Yet somehow we end up in this decades-long war in the Middle East with Iraq and Syria, and elsewhere. And you can see that the initial mission was lost almost immediately. Yet that was the justification to spend trillions of dollars, huge economic loss, and at a huge human toll as well. And I think we're seeing the same sort of thing in Ukraine. So the second article is an article by Connor O'Keefe, who has some excellent content over at the Mises Institute. His article is called, "Is It Just War or Unjustified Slaughter of Innocents?" And this article is more about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But I think this conflict suffers from many of the same problems as the war in Ukraine. So here's the article by Connor O'Keefe. Saturday, and I should back up here, pause momentarily. This article was written October 11th, 2023, just days after the attack in Israel by Hamas. So, just for context, Saturday, the world was rocked by the outbreak of war in southern Israel as Hamas fighters crossed out of Gaza, taking hostages and killing Israeli civilians. The political leader of Hamas says the attacks were in response to the Israeli treatment of Palestinians at the Al-Aqsa Mosque last week. But other reports indicate that the attack was planned for weeks with the help of the Iranian government and was meant to mark the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Over 900 Israelis and 14 American citizens are confirmed dead as of this writing. Music festival attendees and members of a tiny farming community were massacred. Over 100 Israelis and some Americans were taken captive and brought back into Gaza. In response, Israel formally declared war and ordered the largest call-up of reservists in the country's history. On Monday, Israel's defense minister announced a complete siege of Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly. The Israeli Air Force began firing at targets within Gaza shortly after the attack. As of Tuesday, the strikes have killed over 800 people, including dozens of children. One family lost 13 members, 4 of whom were toddlers, when their apartment building was hit. On Monday, a Hamas spokesman threatened to broadcast the execution of an Israeli hostage for every unannounced strike, saying, "The enemy does not understand the language of humanity and morals, so we will address him in the language he knows." Coverage of the war is often intense and emotional, especially when developments are fresh. That is, of course, because the healthy human reaction is to be horrified and angered by reports and footage of people being slaughtered, captured, or forced to flee for their lives. War is no trivial subject. It's violence on the widest scale. At their best, wars can throw off the worst tyrannies and liberate the oppressed, but they can also bring about the worst atrocities. That's why it is so important to have a firm and precise understanding of when violence is justified. History shows that without this, it is far too easy for our healthy human reactions and emotions to be funneled into support for further crimes, trapping us in indiscriminate revenge cycles. The best outline of when violence is justified in the context of war is Murray Rothbard's 1963 essay, War, Peace, and the State. In it, Rothbard shows that the difference between war and all other questions of crime and punishment is simply a matter of scale. Therefore, the general prohibition on invading the persons or property of innocent people is still at play and must be considered absolute. Everyone is justified in resisting or repelling any invasion of their person or property, extracting restitution or exacting punishment in response to an invasion, or helping someone else do the same. However, as Rothbard lays out, one of the most important concepts that often gets lost or forgotten in the fog of war is that violence may only be used to resist or punish the aggressor. Any violence committed against an innocent third party in response to a crime is itself a new crime. If Jones finds that his property is being stolen by Smith, he has the right to repel him and try to catch him. But he has no right to repel him by bombing a building and murdering innocent people, or to catch him by spraying machine gun fire into an innocent crowd. If he does this, he is as much or more of a criminal aggressor as Smith is. The fact that wars are often fought between groups does not change the fact that attacking innocent people is a crime. But even if one doesn't care about the rights of people in the vicinity of the enemy, attacking them is a bad strategy. Killing someone's friends and family motivates them to fight back, not roll over and put down their weapons. That can be seen in the West reactions to the Hamas soldiers' slaughter of Israeli civilians. They want blood. Maybe people on the other side feel that way too. That tragic cycle of indiscriminate attacks, indiscriminate bloodlust, and more indiscriminate attacks defined America's war on terror. As Scott Horton outlines in the introduction to his book, Enough Already, Osama bin Laden and his couple hundred followers planned the 9/11 attacks to draw the United States into Afghanistan in an attempt to replicate the 1980s Afghan war of attrition with the Soviet Union, which contributed to the USSR's downfall. In Horton's words, Al-Qaeda's mission was accomplished when America attacked Afghanistan in 2001. But if the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the hoped-for but unexpected gift to bin Laden, in the words of the former chief of the Central Intelligence Agency's Al-Qaeda unit, the rest of American policy since then must seem like they hit the lottery. The regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia still stand, but America's wars in Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and especially the covert war against the Syrian government from 2011 to 2017 have helped spread bin Ladenite political and religious radicalism and violent conflict throughout the region and into northern and western Africa. Groups declaring loyalty to al-Qaeda or its Iraqi splinter group ISIS now number in the tens of thousands. In other words, even if we accept that the lives of Arabs, Persians, and Pashtuns have no value, that there is nothing immoral about killing their children, the U.S.'s indiscriminate response to 9/11 served only to advance the cause of the enemy and boost their numbers exponentially. But the rights of innocents do matter. Those who attacked and abducted innocent civilians deserve to be brought to justice, and those who killed them deserve to die. But those who did not don't. That it is difficult to capture or kill only the enemy is no excuse for killing the innocent. So there's the article by Connor O'Keefe, and I think he captures the point here pretty masterfully at the end. He says that it is difficult to capture or kill only the enemy is no excuse for killing the innocent. Because let's face it, that's what we've heard throughout the war in the Middle East, the war on terror, and that's what we've heard since the Hamas attack in Israel, which was a horrific attack. I don't ever want to be seen as somehow justifying that attack. It was a criminal, horrific, awful attack by Hamas. But the example Connor O'Keefe uses this example from Murray Rothbard of Jones and Smith. I like to use the example from a self-defense perspective. If someone attacks me, I have justification to respond in self-defense to that person. But I can't track that person down in the middle of a grocery store and shoot up the entire grocery store in hopes of also getting the attacker. That is a micro scale version of how Israel and the United States have responded abroad, killing indiscriminately innocent men, women, and children in an effort to also kill the attacker. The Hamas people who attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023. So I think that it helps. It's easy to get caught up in the weeds and the constant onslaught of the media without taking a more holistic view of what's happening. And I think that these two articles help give some perspective to what's going on. And I like here too that Connor O'Keefe, he alludes to this concept of blowback, which I've talked about on the podcast from time to time. But the idea is exactly what Osama bin Laden stated. He made a written statement about what he wanted to accomplish with the attack on 9/11. And that plan worked out perfectly. As Connor O'Keefe says, it was like he had hit the lottery in terms of the U.S. response, because he knew it would create this cycle of violence, that the U.S. would come in guns blazing and kill innocent women and children and incite hatred toward the United States, and thereby creating more, amplifying the number of Al-Qaeda from hundreds to thousands because of the U.S. response. And that's the idea of blowback, that by going in and taking action that's worse than the action that the terrorists were initially responding to, we create more terrorists and more violent response. So I think that, like I said earlier, I think that we need to heed the advice of Murray Rothbard and the sentiment of the founding fathers, who thought that we should remain neutral with respect to foreign affairs. And I think that that was wise then. I think that it's wise today. So I'll link to these articles in the show notes, and I'll link to the article that I mentioned at the beginning, or sorry, the Gun Digest page that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, where you can find a compilation of all the articles that I've written for Gun Digest. And then once again, don't forget, if you're free on Tuesday night, December 3rd, we're having the church-focused study of the active shooter problem and how to minimize victims with Ed Monk. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe and share to help us spread the message of freedom. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom. You can also find us on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. All right, everybody, until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.